That is the reason why I wanted to have this conversation. The asymmetry that exists with the ways in which the right get to dominate the narrative, dominate violent rhetoric. Charlie Kirk was a great example of this. I even brought up Ben Shapiro earlier on in the conversation. They did cut that part out, I'm pretty sure, because I said this is how Ben Shapiro gets away with being violent. He never says go out and kill black people. He says, in a system where there is disproportionate targeting of black people in the hands of the police, where the state has a monopoly on violence, he says, I want more targeting. I want more police targeting in black communities because they're poor and because they're violent communities that need to be targeted. He doesn't have to say that these are violent thugs, even though he does from time to time, or he doesn't have to directly do a call to action in the same vein that like a Klansman does. He can just lean on the pre-existing violent constructs. That's what I said about Ben Shapiro in this conversation. I don't know if they kept it, because that was the main point that I was trying to put forward. That is my main proposition. My argument is right-wingers, of course, can sit around and say, I abhor political violence, while they demand a metric ton of it. They demand it every day. And when people respond to that now and say, that's fascist, because that is the most like understandable, like most understood form of serialized, systematized violence is fascism, right? It's the type of violent systems that we here in America, luckily, right now, we're still anti-fascist somewhat, look at and say, that's violent. Okay, we look at that and we say, that's violent, that's fascist. And Republicans now want to make it illegal to even say that. And when Ross Douthat comes after people like myself, he's actually leaning into that censorship agenda as well. This is the uneven dynamic is what I'm trying to explain.
I understand your argument, but your strategy for your argument is that effectively advocacy for policies that cause harm, economic harm or physical harm, could itself in this case, right? But we were talking about economic harm earlier, so both apply,
economic harm
right?
also leads to physical harm as well. But
that constitutes a form of, could be argued to constitute a form of incitement, right?
Yes, that's precisely what
you're saying, right?
Yeah, and that's actually the argument with policing,
right? But so
policing is a necessary institution.
But then why
people can just point to it and demand more of it? But that in that demand, they're technically demanding more of the unreasonable outcomes and the unjustifiable outcomes of policing that lead to, for example, the death of George Floyd, right?
Right,
or numerous other cases.
But this analogy is itself part of why people think you are normalizing the things that are taboo, which again would include right-wing forms of violence. But if your theory is all of these things are incitement, if you support...
He's about to say you're a hypocrite, but he doesn't understand you have your own moral compass. Yeah, I mean, I think he's like gearing up to be like, well, that's what you do. Like you're saying that, right-wingers are doing this. That's what you do. And I'm saying, yeah, my job is to describe that is wrong. That's what I'm doing. That's why I think it was important that I laid out initially that like politics is about the distribution of resources and power. And one of the key components of the distribution of power is the distribution of violence. Like who gets to do it, who gets to be on the receiving end of violence. So like in that sense, it is a constant. Yikes, this dude. Yeah, right-wingers do that for police brutality. I say it is unacceptable. Those systems of violence are unacceptable. And one of the undesirable yet inevitable outcomes of such a violent structure is going to be violent resistance. Sometimes that violent resistance is going to be just. Sometimes that violent resistance is going to be unjust. But the very fact that it's not always just in terms of retaliatory violence is the reason why we must solve these issues at the legislative level. That's it. Or at least deal with it in a more organized fashion, in a more directional fashion. That's my argument.
Putting more people in jail, that's incitement. If you support, border security, that's incitement. It's incitement all the
Political violence does not protect the country, protect the speech in the country that you live. What? First of all, the fuck are you talking about? Political violence is a vague term. If you're talking about like actual like killing people, yeah, that's illegal. But if you're talking about like political rhetoric that could be potentially inciting violence or whatever, that is such a vague and nondescript way to describe anything that yes, free speech would in most circumstances until recently would have kicked in and said, "No, fuck that. You can't prosecute that shit at all."
way down. Like you're basically saying the person who incites violence against a politician is in the same position as the person who supports border security. And that seems like an argument that lends itself to encouraging people to commit political violence because you're saying, oh, it's all normal already. What's a little more? What's one more act of incitement in a world of incitement? You're just normalizing it when you make that argument.
Yeah, my argument is that I'm not normalizing it. It's already normal. I don't want it to be normal. I want it to be abnormal. I want people to actually take a serious look at the violent structures that already exist that from the point of the recipient is already experienced as like a direct form of violence. But do you understand the broader point that I tried to arrive at in these conversations, for the record, which of course lend themselves so perfectly to quippy clips to just make it seem as though, you know, this is a person that is very clearly inciting a certain thing. Or do you think I'm just like dancing around the issue? You can be honest.
I think that I'll be honest. I think there's a reason that certain kinds of Marxism and socialist radicalism, when they...
You ain't challenging me? Come on live. It will be. What the fuck? Are you trying to go meat for meat? What's this? Are you trying to go sword fighting with our penises?
Take power or trying to come to power tend to resort to violence. And it is inherent in the argument that you've made. I'm not saying it's an argument that doesn't have a certain power. If it didn't have a certain power, lots of people wouldn't have believed in it, right? There is an inherent violence in the use of state power. There is an inherent coercion in all kinds of policies, including policies that I support, right? You know, I support restrictions on drugs, right? That probably you do not, that absolutely involve coercion. I believe in restrictions on bodily autonomy enforced by state power that uses violence. I believe in that.
Yeah.
I understand that someone can say, as you know, as a radical on the left, this violence exists and we want to redirect the violence. And do I think that you, Hasan Piker, you know, prosperous media personality in Los Angeles, are enthusiastic about, you know, the expropriation of wealth and punitive violence by communist death squads? I don't think you are. But I think that the reason you have strong taboos against sort of, you know, about,
I will say what I'm enthusiastic
to prevent that slope from slipping in that way.
Okay, so I am enthusiastic about the expropriation of wealth for people such as myself as well in the form of taxation, though. And that's basically the grand design that I have.
Right now, though, no one's going to deplatform you, right? You know, Twitch is not going to suspend you for saying that you want to raise taxes on the rich and use the force of the state to take. But what do you think? Like, do you think it was reasonable for Twitch to suspend you for a day for talking about killing Rick Scott? Like, what are the obligations, I guess, I'm asking, of...
What's so crazy about this also is, like, he plays fast and loose with the killing of Rick Scott thing because he also, like, early on recognizes that it's not a death threat, right? Like, he very quickly starts the conversation by being like, it's not a death threat. We both know it. And then he just still kind of brings that back. in a way, in this way, where it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like literally fucking talk about that endlessly? I can't. I have to move on.
Of platforms with this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think it's understandable that Twitch did that, which is why I apologize for the use of my language as well. Like I said, there are certainly instances where it's an emotionally charged conversation, or I'm being careless, and it comes across uh, it 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 reaches an unintended audience that sees it as in this like super short format in a very negative way. It's unfortunately a byproduct of the medium that I'm
Right.
in.
But you're okay.
Real-time
but
discourse
you're, but
happening
you're,
with random anonymous
right.
accounts.
But you're okay with some kind of taboo maintenance here.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
In order for normal discourse to flourish, obviously, some kind of terms of service need to be implemented. You know, like a direct call to violence is, of course, going to be considered
Right.
unacceptable. I totally understand that. Even if it's like being made in jest, or even if it's like being misunderstood in that moment without the appropriate context.
Yeah.
Having said that, however, if we're talking about like broader things, and we didn't really get to talk about this a lot, but a deplatforming initiative has taken place on Twitch and on numerous other platforms, mostly championed by the ADL and some other actors as well, because of my
Now we're
consistent
cooking.
anti-Zionist advocacy. I am an avowed anti-Zionist. I openly say it. I have also spent all of my professional career combating anti-Semitism, which has grown in this country as well. And yet, a lot of these organizations, I think, and a lot of people have falsely maligned and smeared me as an anti-Semite, despite my advocacy against anti-Semitism.
So this brings us to the last area I want to talk about.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a few times growing up in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Just talk about for a minute your background in the Middle East and how it shaped your politics. How it radicalized you might be a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I have, I think, a very different opinion about American foreign policy than the average American has, due to the fact that I didn't grow up in America. I had more proximity or a closeness to, I guess, the recipient of American violence and American intervention, being someone who grew up in Turkey. And
Yes, bro. Middle East is a wild way to talk about it, but it is what it is. Come on, just move
therefore,
on.
my starting position is very different to the way that like the American world police narrative was designed in the United States of America, admonishing its enemies, making them seem as though they're barbaric and deserving of like some kind of direct military intervention. These are things that I obviously considered to be not only wrong, but also incredibly consequential. This kind of sentiment was incredibly consequential for people who had to live in these countries and had to be victims to boots on the ground military warfare and even like the drone wars that greatly escalated under Obama.
What do you think about the government of Turkey?
I I am not a fan of the government of Turkey, and I've written.
Right. So I'm not going to tell you that I have read through every hour, every transcript.
Yeah.
But I feel like I read enough to get a sense of sort of what you mean by hyperbole, right? And it means different things, right? It means like you're talking about landlords and why they're bad. I think you were talking to a landlord friend at the time,
Yeah.
right? But you said, let the streets soak in their bleeping red capitalist blood, dude. Right? So yeah.
I also said in a video game, but
right.
to showcase the silliness of the statement in of itself.
Right, okay. So it's like ironic, or is it Marxist revolutionary rhetoric? I just want to bring this to a fine point. There's the great case of Luigi Mangione, right? Who is charged with murdering the CEO.
Unsurprising that this is presented as some kind of advanced level tone policing critique. Yeah, I mean, that is what it is. Why is he talking to you like the school principal? Because that's what's going on. AKA, he read whatever viral conservatives think this guy wants to genocide the whites clips. Guys, it doesn't matter. Those clips are out there. Ross Douthat is probably one of the better formats and one of the better Republican thinkers to address those clips with. Okay, that's it. No way people are saying you lost the debate. No, who the fuck is saying that? The comments don't seem to think that at all. They actually enjoyed the conversation. Dude, I could fucking absolutely eviscerate whatever interlocutor in the marketplace of ideas, and there is going to be a crop of people online who are going to say, dude, he got fucking owned. That's just what they do. Those are the same people who, quite literally, when I made a public statement about not going to TwitchCon out of concern for the safety of others around me, not even myself, but the safety of others around me, literally use that as an opportunity to dunk.
Okay. More careful with my language. Having said that, given the 10-hour format that I have, there are definitely going to be weak moments where I just like say something without even thinking about what that might come across as.
Yeah. I mean, you do. Again, I read through. You have a lot of content.
For you real quick. Okay? They actually pointed to something that he talked about in his lecture. Okay? The thing he said only comes across as offensive to those who are completely not knowledgeable about the issue, about Hamas. This was it. Are you ready? Richie Torres posting a Canary Mission tweet says, Eric Chaffetz, who's a Cornell professor, demonizes Israel and lionizes Hamas, treating good and evil as evil, good as evil and evil as good. He insists Hamas is morally different from Al-Qaeda and ISIS because it does not advocate for universal jihad. It simply seeks to wipe Israel off the map. Chaffetz is untroubled by genocide when the target is the homeland of the Jewish people. Poisonous professors like Chaffetz are poisoning young minds at taxpayer expense. This is the quote. Unlike Al-Qaeda or ISIS, Hamas does not advocate for universal jihad. It is focused solely on the liberation of Palestine from Zionist fundamentalism, in parentheses apartheid, and the end of the state of Israel. November 4th, 2023. Now, nothing that Eric Chaffetz, who is Jewish himself, by the way, said there is actually even remotely offensive. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. It is what you need from college professors. You need honesty and truth from educators in these esteemed institutes of higher learning like Cornell. What he is saying is factually accurate. Okay? This is not an opinion. This is just a fact. He is describing a fact. But to the broader audience, that fact is something that they don't want to hear. Okay? That's a fact that they do not want to hear. So what do? They bastardize that fact. They chop it up or sometimes directly present that factually accurate statement and go, can you believe this college professor said this? So yes, while certain things might be completely true in an academic context, it can be very dangerous for a much larger audience to hear that scary truth. Okay? At least in the eyes of those who are very powerful and have an interest in making sure that the broader audience doesn't hear the truth. So my problem isn't that I'm engaging in like violent rhetoric or whatever. My problem is that I'm saying stuff like this, but oftentimes also using hyperbole, jokes, and making that process as entertaining as possible. And because of that, I'm able to do that to a much larger audience than a college professor could in their own lecture. That's the fear. That's what makes it so crazy for a lot of people. Because if Eric Chaffetz was saying that on a Twitch stream, he'd get yelled at all the same. As a matter of fact, he's getting yelled at for doing it in a fucking lecture that is directly about anti-colonial movements. His lecture is about Hamas. His lecture is about other indigenous movements that have fought against previous forms of empire and contemporary current forms of empire. Imperial power. It's the medium that I do it and the way that I do it that makes it very scary for a lot of people. Do you understand? Because before the internet, there was a filter, as Noam Chomsky talks about, right? there was a filter for someone to reach a very broad audience, to reach this massive audience, massive number of people. You could only get there if you were from an aristocratic family, or you went to the right schools, you kissed the right asses, and you chose your words very carefully, and you got elevated through the regular process in mainstream news. Okay? And therefore, people self-censored in order to get to that level, in order to be in front of, in order to have the privilege of being in front of a massive audience and to be able to influence them. Whether they were going through that process in a newspaper, or whether they were going through that process through a television channel, doesn't matter. But now that the internet exists, you can have even larger audiences than CNN while sitting in a fucking hotel room or while sitting in your own living room. Okay? And you don't have to filter yourself in that same way. But that's what's so scary about what I'm doing. That's what's so worrisome about what I'm doing, because you can't have people being like Israel's a fucking illegal criminal entity that is doing genocide. Because if there weren't more independent voices on the internet, if there wasn't TikTok, there wasn't like people on Twitter and whatnot saying this over and over again, you wouldn't see this level of mass discontent. It's about controlling flows of information. Why do we think TikTok was sold to Larry Ellison? Because the algorithm that was previously controlled by a foreign government was allowing unique thoughts to flourish in that algorithm. Allowing thoughts that normally, allowing speech that normally would not ever be heard in front of as broad of an audience as it was being heard on TikTok. If this wasn't so important or so scary for those who want to control flows of information, if they didn't consider this to be dangerous, they wouldn't have sold TikTok. They wouldn't have forced TikTok to be sold to someone who is one of the biggest donors to the IDF, right? Yes, even after the sale, it's still controlled by a foreign government. I know. It's Israel instead of China. I know. Doesn't matter.
Country. I think if you want to call Donald Trump a fascist, you're free to do so. If I want to call you a commie, I'm free to do so.
People do it all the time.
People do it all the time.
Yeah.
But this is my reading, and I'll let you tell me why I'm wrong in a minute. I think you push further, and I think you like to play with the rhetoric of violence. So, like, you were suspended from Twitch, I think, for a day.
Still, you are arguing for a process of consolidation that should be normal in a functioning democracy, not calling for anarchy or violence. I know, but his entire purpose here is to say I am actively calling for violence. And if I were to, like, when he initially started asking me about, like, you know, what my worldview is, he wanted me to say, like, no, through a system of violence, we will seize the means of production or some shit. So he could just start talking about how dangerous of a rhetoric it is. And for the record, there are plenty of people who do believe that. And no, that's not a fucking dangerous rhetoric either, okay? That's not. Let's be real. That's not fucking actually dangerous rhetoric. Partially because it's completely marginal, and partially because of the same exact underlying principle that I mentioned as well, which is structural violence being a constant and permanent part of people's existence. And yes, people resisting against that. I'm Osama, you ain't like us, you fucking loser. What? Anyway. I don't know what the fuck that guy was on, but my point is there are people who do believe that, and they are either marginal figures or overall, at most, they're talking about like historic examples that have existed. And the only reason why we see that as like a form of violence, as opposed to like World War II being a form of violence that is like permissible, is because they're on the other side. They're on the opposing side. We're capitalists. It's that simple. If the entire world was socialist and you had a bunch of capitalists living in a fucking socialist government and they were fantasizing about capitalist forms of violence, the socialist government would look at that and go, this is dangerous. This is violent rhetoric. It's that simple. We live in a capitalist country. Of course, any sort of redistributive policies are looked at with tremendous scrutiny. Obviously, that's the reason why people even fucking yell at me when I say we want to give socialized medicine to Americans. Like, that is seen as a dangerous prospect, a dangerous proposition for many people.
It was an argument you were having about Medicare fraud, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the GOP was going to crack down on Medicare fraud. Mm-hmm. And you said, well, if they really cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott. This is the Florida Senator.
People always try to paint you as more radical than you actually present yourself on stream for some reason. You don't even really advocate for violent revolution. You make fun of the revolution now, vanguardists. But they always simultaneously call you a dangerous revolutionary, but also a fake LARPer at the same time. Yes. The reason why people present me as a much more violent and much more radical figure than I actually am is because for the current time frame and for the current material realities that we exist under and for the current political realities that we exist under, my rhetoric reaching this many people is dangerous for them. Okay? Israel gets to mutilate children with regular frequency every single fucking day. Israel gets to annihilate the Palestinian population. That is not seen as violence because that's the state doing that. Okay? How dare you call that out? But on the other side, if you turn around and say, no, people do have, under international law, a complete fucking legal right and moral responsibility to resist against a genocidal apartheid regime destroying their lives, then you're the fucking violent one.
And it's a reference to the fact that Scott's company paid some huge fines for they were engaged in some kind of Medicare fraud, right? But you didn't say we should put Rick Scott in jail for Medicare fraud, right? You said
if you cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott, okay? You wouldn't make Rick Scott, former governor of Florida, Rick Scott.
This is not an Asmongold clip. This is from my own YouTube video, chatters.
You wouldn't make him a prominent part of the Republican Party. Well, this was, for the record, this was in response directly to Mike Johnson. And it is something that I take ownership over. I did apologize for the language that I used instead of saying, like, you know, just you should jail Rick Scott,
right?
Which would have been the most inoffensive. It was a hyperbolic statement that I made, not with like any sort of significant death threat issued to a sitting elected representative. Obviously,
I agree. I don't think you were issuing a death threat. I agree.
Yeah. So, but you're right. That is hyperbolic language for sure, and it's one statement in a grand sea of others that of course gets highlighted through the same outrage machine, and then people demand punishments, and then those punishments do come down, and it causes me to be even more.
Speak on. Truly, we live in some interesting times, especially in the end. Ross comes across as totally out of his depth in a conversation that he's ostensibly leading. Hard to not see this whole exchange being emblematic of the media landscape. The traditional media seems to be operating in an outdated paradigm that stopped in Trump's first term, which was nearly a decade ago now. There's no doubt in my mind that Donald Trump is far more inflammatory than anything this man Hasan Piker can possibly say. And Donald Trump and his disgraceful minions have proven that they will attempt to carry out even every one of their violent and divisive acts in the name of my government. Whatever Mr. Hasan expresses, and I'm not at all familiar with him, I cannot express how disturbing I find the blasé manner in which Mr. Douthat attempts to associate people like me with violent rhetoric wherever it rears his ugly head, especially while he winks away through the disgrace of this administration. He explicitly says he doesn't endorse violence, so strange title. The double standard that the left has to be a paragon of virtue while they say everyone deserves healthcare, food, and a roof over their head is insane. Advocating for policies that end state violence is far less violent than what the right does and says. Hasan has a better grasp of political working class politics and the youth vote than 99.9% of elected Democrats. Now do the version where you investigate most of all political and cultural figures on the right. You don't see permission for violence in Kirk saying that gays should be stoned to death, in Kirk saying that he's willing to accept some gun deaths to maintain American gun culture, in Kirk saying trans people should be lobotomized. This is like people dunking on this Patrick guy who I guess said something like negative about me. You found the original Patrick comment? I'm not MAGA. Voted for Harris. but I'll take 10,000 Charlie Kirks over. But I'll take 10,000 Charlie Kirks over 10,000 Hasan Pikers any day of the week. Pikers all over the map, as you'd expect from someone who streams his consciousness 7 hours a day. But there's an unmistakable permission for violence that runs through his interview. Charlie Kirk never did that. Ezra Klein took a lot of grief for complimenting Kirk's style, but I much prefer the one-on-one logical argumentative style over the run-on, formless dialogue with unseen and unheard viewers, peppering him with cash tips that characterizes Piker's whole shtick. By which I mean, Piker was a great interview subject. Nicely done, Mr. Douthit. I'm sure that many of your readers/listeners had no idea who Piker is or what he does, or the way he offers excuses for shocking violence under the banner of socialism and progressivism. And every one of the New York Times readers is like, what the fuck are you talking about? This is ludicrously revisionist about Charlie Kirk's public stances. Things like Islam is the sword of the left is using to slit the throat of America. Do you think that that's a call for his followers to engage in reasoned, measured debate with conflicting viewpoints to allow themselves to be convinced of things? Come off it. Marxists believe in ending the capitalist system just as liberals believe in ending the feudal system. Whether that process is violent or not is ultimately up to the ruling class. Patrick, more Patrick dunks. If you truly... Dude, they went crazy on my boy Patrick, okay? Patrick simply wanted to get a fucking slam in there and be like, fuck this Hasan guy. Charlie Kirk is so much better than him. And the New York Times readership is eating his ass alive. If you truly believe that Kirk never flirted with permission for violence, then you are very forgetful. Charlie Kirk was very nonchalant about excusing violence. For example, when thugs assaulted store workers and destroyed store property during the Pride Month in 2023, he further encouraged such displays of violence by painting them as shows of force. Literally, tonight we show them that they're the losers. Or when Paul Pelosi was attacked in his own home and Kirk encouraged his followers to bail him out while painting the attacks as karma against the Democrats. Or when he called the biblical passage that calls for the death penalty against homosexuals the perfect rule. Charlie Kirk was not the calm, reasonable, debating type you desperately pretend he was. Bro, if you get this dogpiled this hard by a bunch of fucking Barbaras, Deborahs that are New York Times readers who take the time out to fucking comment on a New York Times article, you gotta fucking unsubscribe from the New York Times, okay? You're cooked. You're getting, this is like getting fucking dunked on in the Pornhub's comment section, okay? Like, they said, smoke them. They fucking lined it up. Like, what are we doing? Douthit responds to Piker using the term adventurism. We already covered this. Today on Interesting Times, Ross pushing harder on a streamer from the left than he does when he interviews people on the right with actual power and incite the perpetuate actual violence. Peter Thiel and JD Vance. It's so obvious how we ended up here as a country and continually discouraging that our media continues to hand us the shovels that we use to dig ourselves deeper into a failing state. And even people who are like somewhat neutral to me that don't know who the fuck I am and are basically like, this is their first introduction to who I am. They basically say this, like, he's a fringe figure. He can have an audience of hundreds of thousands, but think about how tame he is in compared to the American extreme right, or even Rush Limbaugh back in the day. Piker doesn't consider conservatives un-American, doesn't hate them, doesn't want to use the power of the state to literally exterminate them. The reverse simply isn't true. Exactly. I want to literally exterminate their medical debt, dude. That's what I want for conservatives. Conservatives want me deported. I want conservatives' healthcare costs to be deported. That's the difference between me and the average fucking conservative. Now, they can fucking turn around and act as though they're not advocating for violence by simply presenting the Bible. They can be like, oh, the Bible told me it's okay to stone the gays. That's the Bible. Take it up with the Bible over and over again. I don't fucking sit around and go, look at Das Kapital. Das Kapital told me this. That's not what I'm doing. That's Bart from Idaho, by the way, not a Hasanabi head. He is just fine. In case somebody bothers to understand what he's talking about, just fine. We are living in a baffling time in which a Twitch streamer is held to a higher standard than the President of the United States. I listened very carefully to this whole interview. I couldn't help but notice that every time I was especially compelled by Piker's response to something, which is to say, when I thought Piker was about to take down Douthit's assumption, thesis, argument in an especially powerful and eloquent way, Douthit would interrupt and either redirect or focus on a minute point, in effect derailing the narrative. This is a very smart tactic and one that is difficult to combat. It requires the interviewee to have 100% presence of mind and not be knocked off their feet. It's also a cheap tactic, understandable but cheap. Piker at moments overcame it by talking over Douthat's interruptions, but obviously Douthat had the home team advantage. To everyone's credit, though, I thought this was a great conversation, and I would be super supportive of more of this. The two sides need to keep talking to each other in this way instead of staying in echo chambers. Check this one. Hasan Piker has turned his reckless rhetoric into a full-time job. He's the guy who once said America deserved 9/11. Compared to Hamas, okay, this guy is a fucking, this has to be like a Sex Pastini fan, right? I don't think the average New York Times reader is that tuned into, you know, this has got to be like a Ethan Kleiner or like a Asmongold fan or like a Sex Pastini. The lone fucking... Check the YouTube comments. He pinned the one neutral comment. Everyone else is cooking him. Oh, on YouTube, he pinned it. Love the podcast. Quickly becoming the best show. Ross tries to bait Hasan and call for an act of violence. Hasan chuckles. How did growing up in the Middle East radicalize you? This guy's a real piece of work. Nice to see a successful journalist sitting down with an up-and-comer like Ross. This reminds me of why I stopped reading the New York Times in the first place. It's hard to tell if Ross is intentionally misrepresenting Hasan with the explicit intent to deceptively warp his audience's perception, or his worldview is so distorted that he genuinely thinks what he said is true. I don't know which is worse. Insane interview. Ross putting words in Hasan's mouth and basically saying, I don't believe you when you say you don't advocate for violence is embarrassing. Hasan, people are being murdered by health insurance companies because they refuse to provide payment for curable illnesses, diseases, etc. That is structural violence. Ross, I don't know, man. I think you're hyping up the violence. That literally just happened. We just paused it right there. Like literally. That is verbatim a summary of the last 5 minutes of me like thoughtfully trying to describe to him. Dude hated you before the interview, now hates you even more after reading those comments. No, I think like this'll work well for him because he got his point across, I think. And not only that, but also he not only did he get his point across, but then also on top of that, he was able to this will do good numbers. Like he gets good engagement out of this. So I don't think these guys care about that kind of stuff.
Though. Like yes, I agree. You're doing analysis, and sometimes the analysis people would have celebrated Luigi Mangione, obviously, without you, Hasan Piker, talking about him all the time, right? But I listen to the way you talk about him. Like, you're fascinated by him too. You're participating in the fascination, and you're doing a thing where you're like, well, you know, I'm not saying violence is good, but you've got to understand that there's other forms of violence in society besides this one, and people who like Mangione, they're saying this violence maybe isn't as bad as that kind of violence. And this just seems to me like you're not the guy who starts the revolution, but you're the violence appreciator. That's sort of how I feel about your Mangione coverage. You're out there. You're appreciating.
I wouldn't say that that's fair.
It's like, okay, tell me why it's not fair.
But the reason why I'm saying I wouldn't say that that's fair is because, like, I do make it obviously very clear that, and I refer to this over and over again, adventurism and people taking matters into their own hands is a mere reaction to the social contract unwinding in real time in front of us. I don't think this is a good thing. I want to make sure that we have a system that helps everyone. And a part of that is creating the same social stability that existed. Now, you can do that by force, by stamping out dissent and moving in the direction of the Trump administration, or you can try and do that by addressing some of these inequities that exist that do actually harm a lot of people, right? Because I don't think you disagree with my assessment that systems are inherently violent, no matter which way they go, and that... and I assume you understand what I mean when I say like the social murder of tens of thousands of Americans in the process of having their healthcare coverage denied. Like, it must interest you as well, right? Because it interests certainly people at CNN and many other mainstream outlets, like why people are doing this. But their reflection on it is,
I think it's 100% the case that people had certain people.
You want to know why this was a fucking lost cause for Ross? Because I feel like even Elizabeth Warren went on television after, and everyone was like, why are people celebrating Luigi Mangione? We can't understand it. And even fucking Elizabeth Warren was like, why do you think? Like, look at the healthcare system. Like, what do you think is going on in the American healthcare system when people have their care coverage denied? Like, it's over at that point. Like, what do you expect? That's Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is never going to say some shit like that.
People had terrible experiences with the health insurance bureaucracy.
Also, apparently, Ross Douthat defended Pinochet in his Harvard days. And I did not know that, but I mean, that does track. I wonder if did I bring up Pinochet at all in this conversation? Because it did go into numerous directions at times.
Had a reaction to.
I didn't know that he defended Pinochet, but it does make sense.
That is like what you described. I think that's absolutely real, and it says something about the way the system works in America. Yeah. On the other hand, I also think, and again, because I'm not a socialist utopian, right? I think that there is not this magical alternative where, if we only didn't have nasty politicians who love the rich imposing austerity, everyone would get all the care that they want. I don't think that world exists. I have a lot of personally negative experiences with the American healthcare system. I technically still have chronic Lyme disease, which is a disease that officially doesn't exist. It definitely exists. And I have known a lot of people in that world who have a very specific version of the kind of anger you're describing that's directed towards the medical establishment and how it interacts with insurance companies. And, these are people who've had their lives ruined by this illness that the system does not effectively cover or treat. But it's really important, right, as a society, that if one of my friends who had chronic Lyme disease went out and killed someone who they felt was involved in denying them treatment, and maybe was, right, that you wouldn't that it would be irresponsible for me to do a podcast and be like, man, that person looks badass. I think that would be irresponsible, even if I was appreciating something real. And that's where I think it's not you saying it's really interesting how people have this reaction to it is what I'm challenging or questioning. It's the extent to which, again, you're like, oh, he's an adventurer. It's the propaganda of the deed.
He's not an adventurer. He's an adventurist. I think he understands what that means, by the way, because he says propaganda of the deed, so he gets it. Of course, propaganda of the deed would be a more positive association with that sort of thing, whereas adventurism is the Marxist interpretation, which is a negative association with that sort of thing. So obviously, as a fucking Harvard-educated guy, I think he knows. I think he understands that.
Man, well, okay, yeah, but a society that has those adventurers is going to be in a lot of trouble pretty quick.
I agree. I don't disagree with you on this. I think it's a reflection of the very social fabric that keeps us together and keeps us stable.
According to Ross, the proper course of action to respond to Luigi Mangione is to keep watching it happen and do absolutely nothing other than look at each instance of violence and go, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, in perpetuity. You, on the other hand, can go, maybe we can put an end to it, perhaps. Yeah. I mean, it's the same with, like, fucking gun violence. It's the same with gun violence. Like, I feel like I lost my mind a long time ago. Constantly trying to understand, like, constantly trying to make sense of the senseless violence that exists in America. Okay? Where I was just like, what are we doing? Like, this is insane. Please, some sensible legislation, please. Can we have some sensible legislation, please? Nope. Nope. It just doesn't make any sense.
In real time. America is a very violent country, right? But we have systematized this violence and we have normalized it. And inevitably that violence has also come back to the domestic front. where there's unlimited bloodshed happening at schools. I mean, Charlie Kirk's assassination was the 46th school shooting, technically, a shooting that happened at a school. And then the 47th happened only an hour later in Colorado. And our reflection on these sorts of events is that because it's so normalized, because the system must continue, because there are numerous different interests at play here, specifically gun manufacturers, for example, a very important part of our domestic manufacturing industry.
America is an extreme,
and a big part of American culture.
Right, America is an extremely libertarian, personal liberties devoted society in ways that have right-wing connotations, like lots of gun ownership, and left-wing connotations too. But yes, go on.
Certainly. And what I'm trying to say is that in the absence of any sort of significant initiative to claw back some of that, to have some kind of reasonable policy that will say, all right, guys, like, we all like guns. I like guns. I like shooting guns, right? I do not have any sort of gun culture in my development.
You picked it up.
Began my journey of understanding guns because I was writing about gun control, and I was like, I need to learn about this stuff. But having said that, I still believe that there needs to be reasonable gun safety, reasonable gun control. This is not a call to action to say, like, oh, it's awesome that, like, school shootings are happening, or it's awesome that political assassinations are taking place left and right.
No, but nobody.
Okay,
but this is a difference. And
but it's
I
to simply
promise
say that it's no longer just like random school children that are being killed, is what I mean. The only reason why this is becoming a more significant, more consequential problem in the eyes of many people in the media is because it's no longer people that we can just kind of see as collateral damage and, like, consider to be invisible.
I don't think that's right. First of all, I think that the media has
now we start the debate a little bit.
A lot of coverage to school shootings. I think it would be strange to say that the media has ignored that issue in any way, shape, or form.
Oh no, I think the line, that they ignore it.
But I think the line, you're like, the reason people are upset in this case, the reason that people are upset in this particular case, right, is that when school shootings happen, right, there is, except in very online communities, there is not valorization of the school shooters. Nobody calls a school shooter an adventurer, right? And the people, obviously we don't want to live in a world with school shootings, but we especially don't want to live in a world where it seems like people who are sort of in the public scrum, like you, right, are sort of appreciating violence. Like, if I'm pro-life. I think abortion is a form of murder. I think if somebody killed an abortionist and I went in the New York Times the next day and tried to write something that was in the vein of what you said about Mangione,
yeah, the difference is abortion is not murder. Okay, that's the difference, and he knows it's not murder. Whereas someone who is dying from a disease that they could prevent, but because it's paywalled, that is seen as actual fucking murder. Having said that, there are plenty of fucking right-wing commentators who have unironically advocated to directly murder doctors. The most famous example of this, of course, is Bill fucking O'Reilly, which I did bring up. I don't know if they actually is in the cut here. I said Bill O'Reilly quite literally did that with a doctor, Dr. Tiller. He called him Tiller, the baby killer. And then one of his fans went to the church that he was at and shot and killed him.
I concede writing and talking are different, right? But if I'd done that, it wouldn't be published and I might be fired. Not as a violation of my free speech rights, but because I would be crossing a line of, again, not endorsement, but even just appreciation, like the appreciation of the violent act. I think there's a taboo around that for a reason, and you like pushing at that taboo. I just think that's what you like to do.
I don't, it's not something that I like to do necessarily, but I want to examine the contradictions of even what you just said, right? You say abortion is murder. I obviously don't agree with that. I'm pro-choice. I think it's a matter of bodily autonomy, and the government shouldn't interfere in this between a medical professional and a woman. Having said that, you get to argue about women's bodily autonomy being potentially removed by making the argument through the systematized version of violence. Because I think, as you would probably also recognize, abortion restrictions have come down in numerous states since the decision of Roe v. Wade was overturned. And in the process, women have found themselves in this unique predicament where they can't even get their ectopic pregnancies dealt with because their medical professionals are worried about potential prosecution. This has led to a lot of pain and a lot of torment, and maybe even in some instances, death. When you argue on behalf of the pro-life position, you don't have to say, like Bill O'Reilly did, Tiller, the baby killer, and then someone goes out and actually shoots a doctor. You can simply say, I'm not putting words in your mouth. I don't know what your position is on or your advocacy around abortion, but someone of this mindset can easily just advocate for the harm that is done to millions of Americans, potentially, without uttering a single word that could be considered remotely violent by the broadest subsects of American society.
Right. So you're right.
This
you're,
is the
right. No, I.
Okay? It doesn't matter. You need to understand, like, there's just gonna be people that do that regardless.
Of United Healthcare in broad daylight in New York City. And you're going to tell me that you've always said that murder is wrong and that Luigi Mangione should not have committed murder. But you've talked a lot about Luigi. And
of course. I think it's one of the most consequential. It's one of the most consequential instances of adventurism, which I always will say is wrong because I think it invokes social instability, which I think is bad in general to exist under. But what I try to always do, especially with the Luigi Mangione case, is to talk about the concept, for example, of social murder. The notion of our systems that already exist, like the privatization of healthcare and the denial of care that make people infinitely less tolerant than we normally would in a civilized society to an adventurous act of violence, such as the case is with Luigi Mangione.
Who is we?
I'm much more interested in talking about.
Just pause there. That make you're talking, because this is something you've done a bunch, right? You sort of You don't say I love Luigi. You're like, we people are, he's seen as a positive figure. He's for most of America. He says, I'm going to dish out what many Americans have experienced to the figurehead of that pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, like, most Americans sympathize with, like, who is the we who looks at shooting United Healthcare CEO and says, that's understandable?
I think it's the people online that are not necessarily like card-carrying DSA members or whatnot, but just like
that's Democratic Socialists of America,
aunts,
just for
Yeah. Not the like the DSA guys or the Democratic Socialists of America or Party for Socialism and Liberation, but it's like the Barbaras and the Debras, as I like to call it, that live in the Midwest and are truly repulsed by the way that private healthcare operates in this country. And for them, I think the Luigi Mangione case is really unique because Americans do not like political violence, right? Nobody likes it. I mean, this is poll after poll that has shown everyone thinks that obviously murder is wrong. I think murder is wrong. Everyone thinks political violence is wrong. And yet, in the case of Luigi Mangione, a lot of people, I think, had such a deep personal experience with the way that the healthcare system has harmed them in some way that the reaction ultimately was very different than one I had expected. From the moment that, before they even found out who the alleged shooter was, from the moment that people recognized that the victim was the faceless CEO of a healthcare company, everyone immediately understood what the motive was.
Not faceless, right?
No, I'm saying like
For most people, the healthcare
Yes.
company had previously been faceless, and now there was a
Yes,
dead man
yes.
who had a face. Right.
exactly. And
But
I
you're
think
part-
that
but
was
wait, but you're
that
part
was a
of-
unique case that needed to be examined, and that's precisely the reason why the media was covering it in the same way as well. The only difference is that, tonally speaking, they were just more so outraged by the reaction in of itself rather than trying to examine why people felt this way. And I think what I try to do in this situation.
I mean, look at this, bro. Look at this. YouGov, December 17th, 2024. Net favorability of Luigi Mangione, 18 to 29-year-olds, plus 9%. 30 to 44-year-olds, minus 1%. I mean, that's crazy. 18 to 44, either as a positive opinion or like 50-50 split on them. Yeah, if people have more financial security, then they have they have less interest in this kind of like dangerously unstable moment. That's it. If people are hopeless about their future, they end up leaning on adventurism. That is my argument. That is the point I'm making. If Luigi Mangione went out and shot a cop, they would not have responded that way. Okay? If he went out and shot a politician, even people would not have responded that way. But healthcare is such a universal burden on all Americans that they literally understood exactly what the fuck was going on and responded the way that they did.
And many others is to explain why people feel this way. Because for them, when their grandparent has cancer and then that treatment is denied or the coverage is denied, even though they're paying these incredibly costly premiums to this healthcare company, they view that as murder. They view that as a tremendous wrong that was done to them. And I seek to address these problems so that there isn't decentralized forms of violence where people make up their own minds and assume that they have the righteous vindication and they're going to go out and do things like this.
I don't know, man. I think you're kind of a hype man.
Yeah, but that is not a good counter to what I just said. Okay? If we're just going ban for ban on just debate, okay? We're talking about this from just the perspective of a debate, okay? I laid it out exactly. I said decentralized forms of violence is a risk. It's a risk for societal collapse because for many people, society is already unwinding. They understand they have universalized this burden of private healthcare. Okay? For them, they're like Brian Thompson, for the perspective of the average person, is people like Brian Thompson are responsible for a death of a loved one, okay? By denying them coverage. I know he's a cog in the machine and I know he's not directly responsible for it, but that's precisely how people reflected on it. And of course, I think it's worthy of analysis. And he goes, yeah, I don't know, man. How is that how is that? That's not a counter. I don't know. I think you like it. Okay, well, why did I describe everything then? Check the comments. Everything is negative, and he pinned the one neutral comment. Yeah, I have it right here, by the way. I don't know what he personally or what the New York Times personally pinned, but the reader picks are cooking him. I'd love to have someone take the most controversial statements that have been espoused by Hasan and contrast that with the inflammatory and insightful language of the mainstream media and the right. I think some folks would be surprised that, compared to some of Kirk's, Limbaugh's, or Carson's, or Poole's, or Coward's statements, he does not have nearly the same level of anger or vitriol that these people